December 24th, 1944. 3:47 in the afternoon. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The temperature hovers at 18 degrees, and the wind coming off the wetlands carries the smell of burning oak from a dozen wood stoves. Inside Compound B, 73 Japanese soldiers stand in formation outside Mess Hall 4, their breath forming small clouds in the crystalline air. They wear surplus U.S. Army uniforms with the letters PW stenciled in white paint across their backs. Most haven't eaten since dawn. A piece of toast, weak tea, a spoonful of something the Americans call oatmeal, but tastes nothing like the rice gruel they knew. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, 31 years old, fifth in line, notices something wrong immediately. The smell. Not the usual institutional odor of boiled vegetables and weak broth. Something else. Something rich and unfamiliar, almost obscene in its abundance. He glances at the man beside him, Private Kenji Nakamura, who has gone completely still, nostrils flared, eyes narrowed with suspicion, or perhaps recognition of something he cannot name. The mess hall doors open, and white steam billows into the cold Wisconsin air, like smoke from an artillery barrage. Inside, on tables stretched the length of the hall, sit dozens of roasted birds. Takeshi Yamamoto was born in Hiroshima in 1913, the second son of a textile merchant who never quite recovered from the 1923 earthquake that destroyed half his warehouse inventory. Before the war, Takeshi worked as a bookkeeper for a shipping company in Yokohama, a job that required precision, patience, and the ability to make numbers, tell stories that satisfied both the tax inspector and the company president. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that pinched the bridge of his nose, kept his hair cut short and neat, and played shogi on Sunday afternoons at a tea house near the harbor. He was not a natural soldier. When the conscription notice arrived in February 1942, Takeshi's wife, Fumiko, wept quietly in the kitchen while he read the single page 3 times, as if repetition might change the words. His daughter, Michiko, then 7 years old, asked if he would come back with medals like Uncle Hiroshi. He told her he would come back. He did not mention medals. Basic training at Camp Narashino revealed what Takeshi already suspected. He was adequate with a rifle, poor with a bayonet, and completely unsuited for the kind of fanatical courage the instructors demanded. He memorized the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, bowed at the appropriate moments, and kept his thoughts to himself. In June 1942, he shipped out to Rabaul as part of the 38th Division's logistics unit, a posting that suggested someone had noticed his bookkeeping skills and decided they were more valuable than his combat readiness. For 2 years, he managed supply inventories in tunnels carved into volcanic rock, while American bombers turned the sky white with explosions. He calculated ration distributions, tracked ammunition, expenditures, and watched the numbers tell a story no one wanted to hear. They were losing. Supplies grew scarcer. Rice rations dropped from 600 grams per day to 400, then 300, then whatever could be scraped together from dwindling stocks. Men began eating grass, tree bark, anything to fill the void that hunger carved into their bodies. By August 1944, the numbers stopped making sense altogether. On August 17th, during an American artillery barrage that collapsed the Eastern Tunnel Complex, Takeshi's unit received orders to evacuate to a forward position. The order was suicide, dressed in tactical language, 32 men, no air support, no reinforcements. The Americans had already taken the ridgeline. Takeshi made a calculation. He walked into the jungle alone, without his rifle, and surrendered to an American patrol near the Warangoi River. The Marines who found him seemed more surprised than he was. One of them, a corporal from Ohio, who couldn't have been more than 19, gave him water from a canteen and a piece of chocolate that Takeshi was too nauseated to eat. 3 weeks later, after processing through camps in New Guinea and Hawaii, he arrived in California on a transport ship carrying 1,200 Japanese POWs. Then, a train journey across a country so vast, it seemed impossible. Deserts, mountains, endless plains of wheat that stretched to horizons he couldn't comprehend. And finally, in late September, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, where the trees had started turning colors he'd never seen in Hiroshima, and the air smelled of pine and approaching winter. Camp McCoy was one of 23 facilities across the United States, designated for Japanese POWs under the Geneva Convention. By December 1944, these camps held approximately 5,400 Japanese prisoners, a fraction of the 425,000 German and Italian POWs also detained on American soil. The disparity reflected not just the geography of the war, but the ferocity of Pacific combat, where surrender remained rare enough to be remarkable. The Geneva Convention of 1929 stipulated that POWs must receive rations equivalent in quality and quantity to those of the captor nation's depot troops. For German and Italian prisoners, this meant familiar food: bread, potatoes, meat, vegetables. For Japanese prisoners, the regulation created an immediate problem. American depot rations bore no resemblance to Japanese military rations. A standard U.S. Army ration in 1944 provided approximately 4,000 calories per day, heavy on meat, dairy, wheat bread, and canned vegetables. Japanese soldiers had subsisted on 2,400 to 3,000 calories daily, when supplies were adequate, primarily rice, dried fish, pickled vegetables, miso soup, and occasional fresh produce. By 1944, as supply lines collapsed across the Pacific, many Japanese units had been reduced to less than 1,000 calories per day. The prisoners arriving at Camp McCoy averaged 20 to 30 pounds underweight. Medical officers documented cases of beriberi, scurvy, and chronic malnutrition. Many had never consumed dairy products in their lives. Cheese, butter, and milk caused digestive distress that added humiliation to displacement. Wheat bread sat heavy in stomachs accustomed to rice. The meat portions, steaks, chops, ground beef, seemed excessive to the point of obscenity. American camp administrators faced a dilemma. They could provide culturally appropriate food, but obtaining sufficient rice, soy products, and Japanese vegetables in rural Wisconsin in 1944 proved logistically difficult. Or they could serve standard American rations and watch prisoners struggle with food that made them physically ill. Most camps chose a compromise: American rations supplemented with whatever rice could be procured, usually not enough. Camp McCoy's commander, Colonel James Hartford, a career officer who'd served in the Philippines before the war and had some understanding of Asian food culture, authorized the camp commissary to purchase rice in bulk from suppliers in California. But in December 1944, with shipping priorities focused on the European theater and Pacific operations, even this proved irregular. Some weeks there was rice, other weeks there wasn't. The prisoners adapted with the stoicism of men who'd already survived worse. They ate what they could, traded portions among themselves, and saved portions of rice when available to stretch across lean days. They learned to tolerate wheat bread if they toasted it. They discovered that scrambled eggs were less offensive than fried. They still couldn't manage cheese. But Christmas 1944 presented a special challenge. The tradition began with German POWs in 1943. Camp administrators, many of them National Guard officers from Midwestern communities where Christmas meant specific things, decided that even prisoners deserved some observance of the holiday. The Geneva Convention made no specific requirements about holiday meals, but American cultural expectation did. Christmas meant turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. Abundance as both celebration and affirmation of American prosperity. For German and Italian POWs, this translated easily. They understood Christmas. They had their own versions of holiday meals. Turkey wasn't strange to them. The feast felt generous but not incomprehensible. For Japanese prisoners, Christmas meant nothing. Japan was less than 1% Christian in 1944. Most prisoners had never celebrated Christmas, never eaten turkey, never understood why Americans attached such significance to this particular day. December 25th was simply December 25th. Another day of captivity in a foreign land, where the customs made no sense and the food made them sick. Colonel Hartford understood this, at least intellectually, but institutional momentum proved stronger than cultural sensitivity. The camp commissary had already ordered 40 turkeys from a supplier in Madison. The mess staff had been preparing for days. The entire camp infrastructure expected Christmas dinner to happen the same way it happened in every military facility across America. On December 23rd, Hartford called his senior staff together and raised the question. Should they serve turkey to prisoners who wouldn't understand it, couldn't properly digest it, and might interpret it as mockery rather than generosity? His supply officer, Captain Robert Mendez, pointed out that the rice shipment expected before Christmas had been delayed. The prisoners had been eating more bread and potatoes than usual for 2 weeks. They were hungry, genuinely hungry, in a way that made the guards uncomfortable. Whatever they thought about the war or the enemy, watching men go hungry felt wrong. His medical officer, Captain David Weinstein, noted that nutritionally, turkey made sense. High protein, relatively digestible if properly prepared, substantial enough to provide real satiation. Many prisoners needed the calories more than they needed cultural familiarity. His executive officer, Major Richard Sullivan, said bluntly, "They're prisoners. We feed them what we have. They can eat it or not." Hartford made his decision. They would serve Christmas dinner to all prisoners, regardless of cultural background. But he added one instruction. Make sure the serving sizes aren't forced. Let them take what they want. On the morning of December 24th, the mess staff began preparing 40 turkeys for Compound B's 370 Japanese prisoners. The head cook, Sergeant Frank Kowalski from Milwaukee, had roasted his share of Christmas turkeys. He understood timing, temperature, and technique. What he didn't understand was how to make this meaningful to men who'd never tasted poultry that didn't come dried and salted in a military ration tin. He did his best. The turkeys emerged golden, crackling skinned, steaming with juices that pooled in the roasting pans. He prepared stuffing with bread, onions, celery, and sage. He made gravy from the drippings. He opened canned cranberry sauce and sliced it into neat rounds. He baked dinner rolls from scratch. He even managed to procure sweet potatoes, mashed with butter and brown sugar. It was a meal that would have satisfied any American family. It was also a meal completely alien to every man who would eat it. At 3:30 p.m., Sergeant Kowalski opened the mess hall doors to air out the heat and let the aroma drift across the compound. He didn't think about what that smell might mean to men who'd been half-starved for months. He didn't think about how the smell of roasting meat might trigger memories of home, or loss, or the humiliation of dependence. He was just following orders, cooking Christmas dinner, doing his job. Takeshi Yamamoto stood in line and tried to prepare himself. Rumors had circulated through the barracks all morning. Some said the Americans were providing extra rations for a holiday. Others said it was a test. Eat too much, and they'd reduce rations later to compensate. A few insisted it was propaganda, something they'd be photographed doing to prove American generosity to the Red Cross inspectors who visited quarterly. Takeshi believed none of them. He'd learned in 2 years of war and 4 months of captivity that speculation was pointless. Reality arrived when it arrived, usually bearing no resemblance to expectation. The line moved forward. The smell intensified. Beside him, Private Nakamura, a 19-year-old from Nagasaki, who'd surrendered after malaria left him unable to walk, began trembling. Not from cold, from something else. "What is that?" Nakamura whispered. Takeshi didn't answer. He didn't know. They reached the entrance. The steam had dissipated enough to see inside. Long tables stretched the length of the hall, and on those tables, arranged in rows like soldiers themselves, sat dozens of birds. Whole birds, roasted, glistening. Takeshi's first thought was, chickens. His second thought, too large for chickens. His third thought, too much, far too much. An American soldier, young, nervous, gestured them forward. "Come on, move through the line, take a plate, help yourselves." The words meant nothing. Takeshi spoke some English, enough to understand orders, not enough for complex conversation. But the gesture was clear. Take, eat. He picked up a metal tray. The serving line began with rolls. Bread, still warm. He took 2, habit more than hunger. Then mashed sweet potatoes, orange and glistening with butter. Then something dark red and gelatinous he couldn't identify. Then gravy, thick and brown, ladled by Sergeant Kowalski, who said something cheerful and incomprehensible. Then the turkey. An American private, maybe 20 years old, held a long knife and carved slices from the bird nearest him. 3 slices, thick and steaming. He placed them on Takeshi's tray with something like pride. "Merry Christmas," he said. Takeshi bowed slightly, automatically. He moved down the line. More vegetables, more gravy, a slice of pie he couldn't identify. His tray was heavier than any meal he'd received since capture. He found a seat at one of the long tables. Around him, other prisoners were sitting, staring at their trays, with expressions ranging from confusion to something that might have been grief. No one spoke. The mess hall, usually filled with quiet conversation in Japanese, had gone completely silent, except for the sound of American soldiers moving through the kitchen. Takeshi looked at his tray. The turkey steamed slightly in the cool air. The gravy was pooling around the sweet potatoes. The bread was soft enough that his finger left an impression when he touched it. He thought about numbers. The protein content of this single meal probably exceeded a week's worth of rations in Rabaul. The calories might equal 3 days. The abundance was so complete, it felt like an accusation. He picked up his fork. The metal was cold. He cut a piece of turkey. The flesh separated easily, revealing white meat streaked with darker meat near the bone. He lifted it to his mouth. It tasted like nothing he'd ever eaten. Rich, yes. Savory, yes. But beyond that, the flavor was simply foreign. Not unpleasant. Not pleasant. Just other. The texture was soft, almost tender. Nothing like the dried fish or occasional chicken he'd known in Japan. He chewed. He swallowed. Around him, other prisoners were beginning to eat. Some took small bites, experimental. Others ate quickly, mechanically, years of military training overriding cultural hesitation. A few pushed their trays away and sat with their hands folded, unable to cross whatever line this represented. Private Nakamura, seated across from Takeshi, was weeping quietly, not sobbing. Just tears running down his face while he ate, methodically working through every item on his tray, as if the meal were a duty rather than a gift. "Why are you crying?" Takeshi asked softly. Nakamura didn't look up. "My mother made chicken once, for New Year's. She saved for months. He took another bite of turkey. This is too much. It's all too much. Takeshi understood. The generosity felt like cruelty, not because the food was bad or the gesture insincere, but because it revealed the vast gulf between captor and captured. While they had starved, Americans had been eating like this. While their families in Japan tightened belts and rationed rice grain by grain, American families had turkeys, butter, sugar, milk, meat, bread, pie, abundance, so complete it could be served to prisoners as a casual display of wealth. The humiliation wasn't in the captivity. It was in this, being shown exactly how thoroughly they had lost. The meal lasted an hour. Most prisoners ate at least some of the turkey, many out of sheer hunger that overrode cultural discomfort. The Americans had been generous with portions. Each man received a quarter-pound of turkey, roughly equivalent to the meat ration in a standard American Christmas dinner. For men accustomed to rations measured in grams, the sheer quantity was overwhelming. Some suffered predictable digestive consequences. The camp medical staff, forewarned by Captain Weinstein, had prepared for this. They distributed bicarbonate of soda tablets and monitored the barracks that evening for signs of serious distress. Most issues resolved themselves by morning, with nothing more than discomfort and embarrassment. But the physical effects were secondary to the psychological impact. That evening, in Barracks 7, where Takeshi bunked with 43 other enlisted prisoners, the conversation was subdued. Men lay on their cots, too full to move comfortably, processing an experience that had no reference point in their previous lives. Corporal Hideaki Sato, a 34-year-old farmer from Hokkaido, spoke first. "They don't understand." "Understand what?" someone asked. "What it means. That food. They think it's kindness." "Isn't it?" This from a younger prisoner, barely 18, who'd surrendered after being wounded at Paliliu. "No," Sato said. "It's showing us who won. They don't need to beat us. They can just feed us until we understand." Takeshi stayed silent. He wasn't sure Sato was wrong, but he also wasn't sure he was right. Intentions were difficult to read across cultures, across languages, across the gulf of war. Maybe the Americans were being cruel. Maybe they were being kind. Maybe they were simply being American, abundant, careless, generous in a way that didn't require understanding its effect. Near midnight, unable to sleep, Takeshi took out the small notebook he'd been permitted to keep and wrote a letter to his wife. Letters home were censored, limited to 25 lines, forbidden from containing any information about camp location, conditions, or operations. They were exercises in saying nothing meaningful, while still maintaining the fiction of communication. He wrote, "My dear Fumiko, I am well. The weather here is very cold, different from home. Today was a holiday for the Americans. They observe this day with special meals and customs I am still learning to understand. We were given roasted bird, which they tell me is called turkey. It is a very large bird. The meal was substantial. I think often of your cooking. The simplicity of rice and miso soup seems very precious now. I remember the New Year's meals you prepared, the care you took with each dish. Here, abundance is common, but it does not feel the same as home. Please tell Michiko that her father thinks of her every day. I hope she is well in school." He stopped writing. The rest of the lines remained blank. What else was there to say? That he was ashamed, that he was grateful, that he was confused, that the war had reduced him to a man who wept over turkey because it wasn't rice? He folded the letter and sealed it in the envelope provided by the camp authorities. It would be censored, translated, possibly never delivered. But the act of writing it mattered more than its arrival. Christmas morning brought clear skies and temperatures that dropped to 7 degrees. The prisoners in Compound B woke to find that breakfast was back to normal. Weak coffee, oatmeal, toast, a spoonful of jam. The abundance of the previous day had been, as expected, temporary. But something had shifted. At morning formation, when the senior prisoner officer, Lieutenant Masao Fujimoto, conducted roll call, he added an announcement in Japanese. Yesterday's meal was provided according to American custom for their winter holiday. It was not. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Intended as insult. It was intended as observance of their tradition. No one responded. The prisoners stood in formation, breath clouding the air, and absorbed this interpretation. Whether they believed it was another matter. Lieutenant Fujimoto continued, "We will write letters of acknowledgement to the camp commander. This is appropriate under the circumstances." That afternoon, 47 prisoners, including Takeshi, wrote formal thank you notes in careful English or Japanese to Colonel Hartford. Most were brief, formulaic. "Thank you for the meal. It was substantial. We appreciate the consideration shown during your holiday. The food was well prepared and adequate." Takeshi's note was slightly longer. "Dear Colonel Hartford, thank you for the Christmas meal. The turkey was my first experience with this bird. It was well cooked. I understand this is important to your tradition. While our customs differ, I recognize the intention to observe your holiday appropriately. Please extend thanks to the kitchen staff for their effort." He signed it with his full name and prisoner number. The notes were collected, translated where necessary, and delivered to Hartford's office on December 26th. The colonel read through them that evening, sitting at his desk with a glass of whiskey he'd been saving for Christmas Day but hadn't opened. The formality of the notes struck him first. The careful distance, the acknowledgement without enthusiasm, the recognition of effort without joy. He understood, at least partially. These men were prisoners, enemy soldiers. They'd killed Americans, or tried to. They'd participated in a war of extraordinary brutality. Expecting them to embrace an American Christmas dinner with gratitude and warmth was absurd. But something else troubled him. A note from the medical officer, Captain Weinstein, had arrived that morning. It documented the digestive issues, yes, but also something else. 3 prisoners had refused to eat anything at Christmas dinner. They'd sat at the tables, untouched trays in front of them, and waited until the meal was over. When asked why, through translators, they'd said nothing. One of them, Weinstein noted, was Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, age 23, from Tokyo. His medical records showed chronic malnutrition, weight loss of 38 pounds since capture, and protein deficiency severe enough to cause edema in his ankles. He was starving, and he'd refused to eat. Hartford sat with this information for a long time. He thought about the 40 turkeys, the expense, the effort. He thought about Sergeant Kowalski's pride in the meal. He thought about the good intentions that had motivated the entire endeavor. And he thought about Private Tanaka, sitting before a feast, choosing hunger. There was a lesson here about pride, or culture, or the limits of generosity. Hartford wasn't sure which. He only knew that the gulf between captor and captured was wider than food could bridge. He filed the thank you notes in his desk and made a notation for his supply officer. Increase rice purchases when possible. Let them eat what makes sense to them. It was a small concession. It changed nothing about the war, the captivity, or the fundamental power imbalance. But it acknowledged something important. Abundance without understanding was just another form of violence. The story of the Christmas turkey dinner at Camp McCoy never made headlines. It wasn't dramatic enough for newspapers, wasn't tragic enough for congressional inquiry, wasn't unusual enough to warrant official documentation beyond routine camp reports. But among the prisoners, it became a reference point. Years later, when survivors gathered in Japan for reunions or wrote memoirs, many mentioned it. Not with anger or bitterness, but with a kind of bewildered recognition that American captivity had been defined by these moments of cultural collision, not cruelty, not kindness, but profound mutual incomprehension. Takeshi Yamamoto returned to Japan in January 1946 on a repatriation ship from San Francisco. Hiroshima was gone, obliterated by the atomic bomb in August 1945. His parents' house had vanished. His wife and daughter had evacuated to a village outside the city and survived, malnourished, but alive. He never spoke about Camp McCoy. When friends asked about his experience as a POW, he said only, "I was treated correctly." He returned to bookkeeping, worked for a textile company in Osaka, lived quietly until his death in 1983, at age 70. Among his effects, his daughter Michiko found a small notebook containing sketches and notes from Camp McCoy. One entry, dated December 24, 1944, described the Christmas dinner in precise detail. The temperature, the smell, the weight of the tray, the taste of the turkey. At the bottom of the page, in very small handwriting, he'd added, "I could not decide if this was generosity or demonstration. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps Americans do not see a difference." Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, the prisoner who refused to eat, was repatriated in March 1946. He returned to Tokyo, where he learned that his entire family, parents, 2 sisters, younger brother, had died in the firebombing of March 1945. He worked various jobs, never married, and died in 1971. He left no written record of his POW experience. Colonel James Hartford retired from the Army in 1948 and returned to Illinois. He never publicly discussed his command of Camp McCoy's Japanese POW compound, though his private papers, donated to the Wisconsin Historical Society after his death in 1976, contain extensive notes about the cultural challenges of managing Japanese prisoners. Among these notes is a memorandum dated December 27, 1944, addressed to the camp quartermaster. For future reference, cultural appropriateness matters more than American custom. Feed them rice when possible. They need calories, not traditions they don't understand. Sergeant Frank Kowalski, the head cook, returned to Milwaukee after the war and opened a restaurant that specialized in traditional Polish cuisine. He never served turkey. When asked about his military service, he mentioned cooking for POWs, but didn't elaborate. His granddaughter, in a 2003 oral history interview, recalled him saying once, "You can cook a perfect meal and still not feed anybody. I learned that in Wisconsin." The larger story of Japanese POWs in American camps remains obscure compared to the more extensive documentation of German and Italian captivity. Of the approximately 5,400 Japanese POWs held in the United States during WW2, fewer than 200 wrote memoirs or left detailed accounts. The culture of shame surrounding surrender made many reluctant to discuss their experiences even decades later. But the accounts that do exist consistently mention food, not as a central issue, but as a persistent source of disorientation. American abundance, even in military rations, seemed incomprehensible to men who'd served in armies where starvation was routine. The generosity felt excessive, confusing, sometimes offensive in its carelessness. Modern military cultural training acknowledges this complexity. The U.S. military's current POW detainee handling protocols emphasize culturally appropriate feeding not as a courtesy, but as a strategic necessity. Food is never neutral. It carries meanings that transcend nutrition. The Christmas turkey incident at Camp McCoy represents this principle in miniature. Good intentions, meeting cultural incomprehension, generosity revealing power disparity, abundance exposing loss. The Americans meant well. The prisoners received calories they needed. No one was harmed. Yet something was damaged that day. Some possibility of mutual understanding that remained just out of reach, separated by the gulf of language, culture, and the fundamental inequality of captivity. Today, Camp McCoy, now Fort McCoy, still operates as a U.S. Army training facility. The buildings that housed Compound B were demolished in the 1950s. No markers indicate where Japanese POWs spent Christmas 1944 eating turkey for the first time. In Hiroshima, rebuilt and thriving, a small museum dedicated to POW experiences includes a section on Japanese prisoners held in America. Among the artifacts is a mess kit tray, standard U.S. Army issue, donated by the family of a former prisoner. The placard beside it reads, in Japanese and English, Japanese POWs in American camps received rations far exceeding what they had known in military service or expected under the Geneva Convention. This abundance was difficult to reconcile with their experiences of wartime deprivation. Food became a symbol of the vast differences between American and Japanese military cultures. The text doesn't mention turkey specifically. It doesn't need to. The story lives on in fragments, in memoirs, in military reports, in oral histories collected decades later from aging survivors who finally felt able to speak. It lives on in the recognition that even small moments of cultural collision reveal fundamental truths about war, power, and the limits of generosity. Takeshi Yamamoto's daughter, now in her 80s, still has her father's notebook. She's never published it or shared it widely. But she remembers reading it as a young woman, trying to understand the father who returned from war, so quiet, so distant. One passage stayed with her. The Americans gave us a feast. We ate like wealthy men, and yet I have never felt poorer. Not because the food was wrong, but because it was right for them, wrong for us, impossible to reconcile. They could not understand why we did not rejoice. We could not explain that abundance itself can be a cruelty when it shows you exactly how much you have lost. She keeps the notebook in a desk drawer. Sometimes, on winter evenings, when the temperature drops and the air carries that peculiar clarity of deep cold, she takes it out and reads those words again. She thinks about her father, 31 years old, standing in line in Wisconsin, smelling roasted turkey for the first time. She thinks about the Americans who cooked that meal, who meant well, who never understood. She thinks about the impossible distance between good intentions and lived experience. And she understands, as her father understood, that some things cannot be bridged, not by food, not by generosity, not even by goodwill. Some gulfs are too wide, some differences too profound. The turkey was perfect, the meal was abundant, the gesture was sincere, and still, somehow, it was all wrong. That's what war does. It makes even kindness complicated.